Another argument for restricting trade is the infant industry argument. A new industry argues for temporary protection until it is mature and can compete with foreign firms. An example of this would be with car batteries for electric vehicles. The Korean companies are a lot farther ahead than the U.S. companies. There was a company called A123 Systems that got a lot of government assistance, and this was their argument, that they were an infant industry, they needed temporary protection, they needed temporary help from the government that other companies wouldn't normally get, so they could compete with foreign firms. An economist's response to that would be that it's difficult for the government to determine which industries will eventually become profitable and would would be worthy of getting that benefit. And there's obviously a cost of restricting imports in that situation. So what ended up happening with A123 Systems is they went bankrupt, and it was a wrong choice by the government as to which industry should receive those benefits. So basically the idea is if a firm's going to be profitable in the long run, that it should be willing to incur the temporary losses, knowing that we'll be able to pay those off in the future. Another argument for restricting trade would be the unfair competition argument. Producers argue their competitors in another country have an unfair advantage because of government subsidies. So let's say they say, oh, well, the Chinese government is subsidizing tires, and so they're able to undercut the market and sell tires cheaper than we are here in America. Well, the economist's response would be that that's a good thing, that we're importing really cheap products, and the price is kind of being paid by the other country's taxpayers because the government is paying some of that price of production. And we're able to get cheaper products, and our gain to the consumers will exceed the losses to our producers. Yes, it will hurt the producers, but the gains to our consumers will be greater. And another argument for restricting trade would be the protection as bargaining chip argument, that an example here, the U.S. can threaten to import quotas to limit imports of French wine unless France lifts their quotas on American beef. So if one country is having import quotas, the U.S. could threaten to have limitations on imports of the product from their other country. So really, there's two bad options here if France doesn't go along with it. One, we restrict the imports from France, which would reduce our welfare in the U.S. with a lower consumer surplus. But then, letter B, if they don't restrict the imports, and we don't restrict the imports, that's going to reduce the U.S. credibility in the marketplace. So a lot of trade agreements have come about. A country wants to liberalize trade. They could have reductions in trade restrictions. They can make multilateral agreements with other nations to reduce tariffs and taxes. An example of that would be NAFTA, as I mentioned earlier, the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is what Ross Perot called the giant sucking sound back in 1992 when he was campaigning for president. He said if we passed NAFTA, we would hear this giant sucking sound of our jobs going to Mexico. And while there might be some losses, he was a businessman, there might be some losses from the producer surplus in that situation. It really would be a net gain to the consumer, and there'd be a greater consumer surplus. So our net gains in research have shown that NAFTA was actually a good thing, and we've seen net gains from the trade with NAFTA. And then GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, is another example of a trade agreement. And the WTO, the World Trade Organization, enforces trade agreements and resolves disputes around the country, or around the world, I'm sorry. So our summary here, a country will export a good if the world price of the good is higher than the domestic price without trade. Trade raises our producer surplus, reduces consumer surplus, but raises total surplus. So export raises the producer surplus. They have a bigger market to sell to. If we're importing goods, it's going to lower that producer surplus because now they've got competition from overseas, but it's going to raise the consumer and the total surplus. So again, we see a gain from it. The consumers are the ones that are feeling that gain. A tariff benefits producers and generates revenue for the government, but there's losses to consumers that exceed those gains, is what we saw with the tariff. Common arguments for restricting trade include those 5 that we went through: protecting jobs, defending national security, helping infant industries, preventing unfair competition, responding to foreign trade restrictions. And some of those have merit in certain cases for certain groups of people, but overall, free trade is usually the better policy.